Okay, we're ready.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Well, my name is Edwin Ellington. Life for me began March 6, 1921. Now, my dad was a fan of the governor of Kentucky at that time, and his name was Edwin P. Morrow. And after I grew up, I researched his name, and I found that his name was Edwin P. Morrow, and my dad gave me his full name. So I've researched and found that the P in the governor's name was a strange name. It was porch, just like the front porch or back porch. So my mother being of Perry, I changed porch to Edwin Perry Morrow Ellington. And of course, I rarely used a full name. It would have been taken a lot of paper if I'd used that in a legal sense or for actually a normal sense. But I want to tell you about my parents, and like many people, the older I get, the more intelligent they became. But I'd say their main attribute was a high moral character. They they were, by today's standard, would be considered poorly educated in a formal sense, but mentally they were highly intelligent people, honest, God-fearing people. As for the environment, it would be considered somewhere below what we call third world today, because things were simple and crude, and the occupation had to be mainly agricultural. So Dad always said that he raised corn to feed his horse, so he would have some way to plow his farm by the next season, and so that he could have another feed for the horse. Now life was simple and austere, and I doubt if a wealthy person then would have, well, primarily his wealth would be in land. Well, my dad was poor, and he had purchased a hillside farm for $40 or $50 from the current owner, and that was about it. Now, he could not make a living wage on that poor ground, so he did many types of work in order to survive, and that might consist of helping to build a railroad which was called the Moorhead and North Fork Railroad. And the purpose of that railroad was to transport timber out of the forest, which he at times would be a logger. He would cut the trees and they would be taken into the nearest city, which was Moorhead, Kentucky, which was maybe 30 or so miles away, maybe less by the way the crow flies. But that was, those were my people, James and Nanny Ellington. Dad's name was up for question. His middle name was Leslie, and I somewhere got the idea that his middle name was Lemuel, and I'm not sure where I got that, but his recorded name was James Leslie Ellington, born in 1882. And my mother's name was Nanny Harry Ellington, born 4 years younger than my dad. But their one trait was honesty, truthfulness, and that was pounded into each of the children, which I will now name for you. Some of the names, some of the ages and birthdays I do not have in my memory, but Loris Ellington, Lorice, was the eldest of the 7 of these 6 early children. Later was Lita Mae Ellington, who later was married to Charles Newsom, and they had several children, starting with a Charles Jr. and then ending with a James Ronald. In between, there were two girls, Lorraine and wait a minute, I've forgotten the other name. Anyway, I'll get back to that. But then there was Lester William Ellington, who was married to a lady by the name of Nancy. Nancy.
Was it Nanny or?
No,
Nancy.
Nancy. Maynard. Nancy Maynard, who came from Inez, Kentucky. And then there was Lucy May, who was married to Roy Cook, and they had a daughter by the name of Phyllis Ann. Now, Lenora died as a result of childbirth and a problem with her kidneys, and she lived in Westwood, Kentucky, where all of us later lived. And but when I was 2 years old, my dad had come to Ashland, Kentucky, and to be a a carpenter constructing a new steel mill which was coming to Ashland, Kentucky. And the story of that mill is part of my history, which I will relate when it becomes timely. But then, at the age of 2 years old, my mother and the two elder brothers loaded up what meager belongings they had in a horse-drawn wagon and drove those to the railhead, which was in a place called Paragon, Kentucky.
Let me ask you this, now going back when your siblings, Lester was the oldest, right, or Loris?
Loris.
And how many years older was he then?
They were
10 years?
No, they were more like 2 or 3 years apart.
All right, so where did they go to school? Now this was in Morgan County, Kentucky, so
right.
How far away was school?
Well,
how'd they get there?
Well, the school was roughly a mile and a half from their farm, and it was a very meager school, and I can remember my brothers talking about it, a teacher named Leslie Fraley, and he was one that was that they all seemed to admire. But the school was probably in session no more than 6 years, and it was the schedule was programmed
6 months.
So that the students would be available to aid in the seasonal farm work. And their cash crop consisted of tobacco, which was harvested in the fall and stored in barns to be dried or cured.
Oh, how big was the school? Was it like one room, or?
The school was a one-room school, a frame building, which the building later became a church, and then I believe at one time it became a home. But when it was a church, it was my first memory of seeing the school building, which was by that time was standing as a church, and this was after I was an adult. But
so what did the how did they take these crops they grew?
well,
and they also had chickens, didn't they? Or
there was a story about one of the industries in Morgan County was the illegal manufacture of liquor. It was called White Lightning, and it was illegal, except the manufacturer, who were called moonshiners, didn't pay the tax on the liquor. And each community had a storehouse where the liquor was stored, and if it were legal, it would be taxed by the federal government. If it were illegal, it would never see the storeroom. It would be sold, as they would say, moonshine. Indicates it maybe been marketed while the moon was up. Of course, the legal.
So this was pretty common, and did they use corn to make this?
Yeah, and there was no moral compulsion considered on the manufacturing of what we will now call booze. It was just another way of marketing the corn that they grew. And the two ingredients for moonshine was sugar and corn. And so it was done in what's called a still, which was a distilling process. And this distilling is now a common practice.
So your dad did make some of this, right?
Well, I questioned about telling that. I wasn't sure whether I should.
Oh, well, it's.
Well, of course, like I said, there was no moral compunction attached to brewing moonshine.
Right.
People just thought of it as another way of marketing the corn, and so there was if caught, a person would be prosecuted, and that could happen. But now my mother's family, her dad was A.W. Anderson William Perry, and he was locally known for reasons beyond me as Bob Perry, and he was considered a righteous man and a considerable landowner, which was able to deed all of his boys a piece of land. And the custom then was the male received the land, and the daughter was understood that her husband would receive land from his background, and so it was not considered unfair that the males received the land, and but my dad's father was Thomas N. Ellington, and his mother was Rachel Cassidy Ellington, and they were to some degree related in a distant way, and there was no compunction attached to that sort of marriage in those early days. The county government was simple and crude, and each landowner, instead of paying a tax on his property, was required to donate a given amount of labor annually on the county roads. Each landowner did his allotted labor to keep a passable road, which was barely passable and normally without any finished surface, whatever. And I've often heard that there was the difference between people was not in a court but in a vacant field where it was settled by means that we don't even think about in these days.
Okay, all right, well, we'll stop there and pick it up on the next session.